Maya Rodriguez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she knelt in the dusty Arizona. Dirt and the summer heat made her work. Clothes stick to her skin, but she did not care because this was the best job she had ever had, and Dr. Helen Carter had picked her from hundreds of students who wanted to spend their summer doing real archaeology work. Instead of flipping burgers or working at the mall like her friends back home, the dig site looked like nothing special from the outside, just rocks and sand, and scrub brush scattered across the desert. But underground, they had found something amazing, and Maya had been part of the team that discovered the entrance to what looked like an ancient underground complex that was older than anything else they had ever seen in North America. And the strange thing was that the rocks around the entrance seemed to glow with a faint blue light that showed up on their equipment, but not to the naked eye. Maya had been working at the site for 3 weeks now, and every day brought new surprises, and today, Dr. Carter had assigned her to explore a new section of the underground chambers that the ground-penetrating radar had detected deep beneath the main complex, and Maya felt excited and nervous at the same time because she would be the first person to see whatever was down there. She grabbed her flashlight and camera and followed the rope line that the team had set up to guide people through the twisting passages, and the walls around her were covered with symbols that none of the experts could read, and they seemed to be carved into some kind of metal that never rusted or tarnished. Despite being underground for who knew how long, the passage sloped downward for about 50 feet before opening into a large chamber, and Maya gasped when her flashlight beam hit the far wall, because there, in the center of the room, was something that definitely did not belong in an ancient American archaeological site. Looked like a suit of armor, but not like any armor she had seen in museums or movies, and it was sleek and organic looking, like it had been grown rather than made, and it seemed to pulse with the same blue light that surrounded the entrance to the complex, and Maya could see that it was standing upright in what looked like a clear crystal case. She called out to Dr. Carter on her radio, but got only static in return, and Maya realized she was probably too deep underground for the signal to reach the surface. But she could not resist getting a closer look at the incredible discovery. The armor was beautiful in a scary way, and it looked like it would fit a human perfectly, and Maya could see that it had no joints or seams like regular armor, but instead seemed to flow like liquid metal that had been frozen in the shape of a protective suit, and there were strange symbols along the arms and chest that glowed brighter as she got closer. Maya walked around the crystal case looking for any kind of opening or controls, but the surface was perfectly smooth, and when she pressed her hands against it, the crystal felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate slightly under her palms. She took dozens of photos from every angle and made notes about everything she could see, but something about the armor called to her, and she found herself reaching out to touch the crystal case again, and this time, when her fingers made contact, the entire case began to glow brighter. The crystal started to dissolve, like ice melting in fast forward, and Maya jumped back in surprise, but she was not fast enough, and some of the liquid crystal splashed onto her hand, and instead of burning her skin, it felt cool and tingly, and where it touched her, she could see her skin beginning to glow with the same blue light. Maya stared at her hand in shock, and tried to wipe off the glowing substance, but it had already soaked into her skin, and she could feel a strange energy spreading up her arm, and she wanted to run, but her feet would not move, and she watched in amazement and terror as the armor began to move. The suit stepped out of the dissolving crystal case, and Maya could see that it was not empty but filled with some kind of flowing liquid metal that moved like it was alive, and the armor turned to look at her with eyes that glowed like blue stars, and Maya tried to scream, but no sound came out. The armor reached out one hand toward her, and Maya felt herself stepping forward even though her mind was screaming at her to run, and when the metal fingers touched her shoulder, the armor began to flow like water, and Maya watched in horror as it spread across her body, covering her skin with liquid metal that felt warm and alive within seconds. The armor had covered her completely, and Maya could feel it bonding with her at a level deeper than skin and bone, and suddenly her mind was filled with knowledge that was not her own, and she could see the history of a race called the who had ruled the galaxy thousands of years ago. Before they disappeared, leaving only their technology behind, the armor was not just protection, but a partner, and teacher, and weapon, all combined, and it had been waiting in the crystal case for someone compatible to find it, and Maya realized that she was no longer just a 17-year-old girl from Phoenix, but something new, and powerful, and dangerous. She could feel the armor analyzing her body and mind, and making changes to both, and her vision became sharper, and her hearing more sensitive, and her muscles felt stronger than they ever had before, and information flowed through her consciousness like water through a pipe, telling her about star maps, and weapon systems, and battle tactics that humans had never dreamed of. Maya tried to take off the armor, but it would not come off, because it was now part of her, and she understood that her life had changed forever, and she was no longer entirely human, but something hybrid between her species and the ancient Kithara, who had built this incredible technology. She looked at her hands and saw that they now ended in claws that could cut through metal, and her reflection in the crystal fragments showed eyes that glowed with blue fire, and when she spoke, her voice had a harmonic quality that had not been there before. Maya knew that she had to get back to the surface and tell Dr. Carter what had happened, but she also knew that nothing would ever be the same, and the armor whispered to her that great changes were coming to Earth, and that she would be at the center of them whether she wanted to be or not. She walked back through the passages toward the surface, and with each step she felt more comfortable in her new skin, and by the time she reached the entrance her movements had become fluid and graceful, like a predator in Maya Rodriguez. The archaeology student was gone forever, replaced by something the galaxy had not seen for 3,000 years. 3 weeks had passed since Maya emerged from the underground chamber, and nothing had been the same since that day, and Dr. Carter had tried every test and scan available to understand what had happened to her student, but the armor seemed to be made of materials that human science could not identify, and Maya herself had changed in ways that were both amazing and frightening. Maya no longer needed much sleep or food, and she could run for hours without getting tired, and her reflexes had become so fast that she could catch flies out of the air without thinking about it, and her mind processed information at speeds that made computers look slow, and she found herself understanding complex problems that would have baffled her just weeks before. The government had gotten involved, of course, and agents from every 3-letter agency had come to study Maya and the dig site, but she had cooperated with their tests because the armor told her that bigger changes were coming and humanity would need to be ready, and she was the key to their survival. Dr. Carter had been amazed by the transformation, but also worried about her student, and Maya appreciated the concern, but she could feel something building in space, above Earth, and the armor was preparing her for what was about to happen, and every day she grew stronger and faster and smarter as the Kithara technology integrated more completely with her human biology. Then, on a Tuesday morning in July, the sky changed forever, and massive ships appeared in orbit around Earth like dark clouds blotting out the sun, and they were huge beyond anything humans had ever built, and Maya felt the armor respond to their presence with what could only be called excitement. The ships belonged to something called the Zilani Empire, and they sent a message to every government on Earth at the same time, and the message was simple and terrifying, and it said that Earth had been chosen for integration into the Empire, and all humans would submit or face extinction, and they had 24 hours to surrender. Maya watched the news coverage from the temporary lab that had been set up at the dig site, and she could see the panic spreading across the world as people realized that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that their new neighbors were not friendly, and she felt sorry for her species because they had no idea what they were facing. General Patricia Hayes had been put in charge of Earth's defense, and she was a good soldier, but the armor told Maya that conventional human weapons would be useless against Zilani technology, and the only hope for survival was the ancient Kithara systems that now flowed through Maya's body like a second bloodstream. Maya decided it was time to reveal herself to the world, and she walked into the United Nations building in New York, wearing the armor in its full glory, and security guards tried to stop her, but she moved between them like they were standing still, and their bullets bounced off her skin like raindrops she found. General Hayes, in the emergency command center, surrounded by screens showing the alien ships, and the general was coordinating with military forces around the world, but Maya could see the hopelessness in her eyes because Earth's weapons were toys compared to what waited in orbit above them. Maya introduced herself and explained about the armor and the Kithara, and General Hayes listened with the expression of someone whose world had just gotten much more complicated, but also more hopeful, and Maya told her that the Zilani had never faced Kithara technology because they had only risen to power after the ancient warriors disappeared. The plan Maya proposed sounded like suicide to everyone in the room, but the armor had shown her the specifications of the Zilani ships, and she could see their weaknesses like bright lights in the darkness, and she would board their flagship alone and disable their command structure and force them to surrender. General Hayes tried to argue, but Maya was already walking toward the window, and the armor shifted and flowed around her, creating systems that would let her survive in space, and she stepped through the glass without breaking it because the armor bent reality around her in ways that human physics could not explain. Maya rose into the sky like a rocket, but without fire or thrust, because the armor used gravitic manipulation to move, and she could feel the Zilani sensors trying to track her, but their technology could not lock onto Kithara stealth systems, and she was invisible to their weapons. The flagship was called War Breaker, and it was 1 kilometer long and bristling with weapons that could crack planets, and Maya felt small next to it, but the armor reminded her that size meant nothing when you had the right tools, and she began her assault. The armor created energy blades that extended from her forearms, and they cut through the Zilani hull like it was made of paper, and Maya carved her way into the ship, and immediately the corridors filled with armed soldiers who looked like giant insects with 2 bony arms, and they fired plasma weapons that would have vaporized any human, but Maya was no longer entirely human, and the armor absorbed the energy and redirected it back at her attackers, and she moved through the ship like a force of nature, and the Kithara tactical systems showed her the quickest path to the bridge, while simultaneously analyzing Zilani technology and finding ways to turn it against them. She reached a security checkpoint, and instead of fighting through it, the armor interfaced with the Zilani computers, and Maya uploaded viral programs that had been perfected by the Kithara thousands of years ago, and within seconds she had control of the ship's defense systems, and she turned the automated guns against the crew captain. Zefter commanded the World Breaker, and he had conquered 47 worlds in his career, and he had never encountered resistance that lasted more than a few hours. But when Maya reached his bridge, he was waiting with his personal guard, and they were all 8 feet tall, with natural armor and weapons that could punch holes in starship hulls. Battle was over in 30 seconds, and Maya moved like lightning while the armor predicted every attack and showed her exactly where to strike, and her energy blades cut through Zilani armor like it was made of cloth. And when the smoke cleared, Captain Zefter was on the floor, and his guards were scattered around the bridge like broken toys. Maya stood over the defeated captain and offered him a choice, and she could surrender his fleet and become prisoners of war, or she could disable their life support and let them suffocate in space. And Captain Zefter had never been given such terms by what he had thought was a primitive species, and he chose survival. Within an hour, the entire Zilani invasion fleet had powered down their weapons, and Maya transmitted the surrender to Earth, and she could see the celebrations beginning in every major city as humanity realized they had been saved by one of their own, and General Hayes called her a hero. But Maya knew this was just the beginning. The armor told her that news of the Zilani defeat would spread across the galaxy within days, and other species would learn that humans now possessed Kithara technology, and some would want to be allies, but others would see Earth as a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could grow stronger. Maya looked out at the stars from the bridge of the World Breaker, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, because she was no longer just Maya Rodriguez. from Phoenix but the guardian of her entire species, and the armor whispered that great challenges lay ahead but also great opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. Captain Zephyr had ruled the bridge of the Worldbreaker for 15 years, and in all that time he had never felt fear, because the Zilani Empire was the strongest force in the known galaxy, and their weapons could turn planets into dust, and their warriors were bred for conquest, and had never known defeat. But now, he stared at his sensor displays and felt something cold growing in his stomach. The human approaching his ship registered as a single life form on the scanners, and Zephyr almost laughed because it seemed impossible that any creature could survive in the vacuum of space without protection. But the readings were clear, and something was coming toward them at incredible speed, and his weapons officer could not get a targeting lock. Maya moved through space like she was swimming through water, and the armor provided everything she needed to survive, and the Cathara technology had turned her into something that could exist in any environment, and she felt more alive than she ever had as she approached the massive alien warship. The Worldbreaker was a terrifying sight up close, and its hull was covered with weapon ports that could destroy cities, and Maya could see Zilani soldiers moving behind transparent sections, and they looked like nightmares with their insect features and multiple arms. But the armor showed her their weaknesses, and she felt no fear. She landed on the hull and began cutting through the metal with energy blades that the armor projected from her hands, and the Zilani materials were strong, but they had never been designed to resist Cathara weapons, and Maya carved through armor plating that was 3 feet thick like it was paper. Alarms began screaming throughout the ship as atmosphere vented into space, and Zephyr ordered his crew to battle stations, but he had no idea what he was fighting, and his sensors showed the intruder moving through his ship like a ghost, and wherever she went, his cisterns began failing. Maya found herself in a corridor filled with Zilani warriors, and they opened fire with plasma rifles that should have vaporized any living creature. But the armor absorbed the energy and converted it into power for her own weapons, and she moved between the soldiers faster than their eyes could track. The first warrior died before he could fire a second shot, and Maya's energy blade took his head off cleanly, and the second warrior managed to squeeze off 3 shots before Maya reached him, and her clawed hand punched through his chest armor like it was made of cardboard. Lieutenant Commander Alan Stone watched from Earth's orbital defense station, and his instruments showed readings that should have been impossible, and Maya's heart rate was steady, while her body temperature remained normal, even though she was fighting for her life in the vacuum of space, and he began to understand that she was no longer entirely human. Maya moved deeper into the ship, and the armor interfaced with Zilani computer systems and uploaded viral programs that had been created by the greatest military minds in galactic history, and within minutes, she had control of the ship's internal defenses, and began turning them against the crew. Automated turrets that had been designed to repel boarders swiveled to target Zilani soldiers, and the crew found themselves under attack by their own ship, and Maya used their confusion to advance toward the bridge, while the armor analyzed their technology and found ways to improve upon it. She reached the armory and found weapons that could crack moons, but the armor dismissed them as primitive compared to Cathara technology, and Maya realized that her people had been the apex predators of the galaxy, and no wonder other species had been relieved when they disappeared. Helen Carter monitored the situation from the command center in Arizona, and she could barely recognize her former student in the readings they were receiving, and Maya's brain activity showed patterns that no human had ever displayed, and her body was operating at efficiency levels that should have been impossible. Maya encountered a squad of elite Zilani guards who were bigger and better armed than the regular soldiers, and they fought with 4 arms each and moved with trained precision, but the armor made her faster and stronger and smarter, and she defeated them without taking a single hit. The viral programs had spread through the ship's systems, and Maya now had access to everything, including the life support and artificial gravity, and she could have killed the entire crew with a thought, but something in her human nature made her choose a different path. She reached the bridge and found Captain Zephyr waiting with his personal guard, and they were the finest warriors the Zalani Empire had produced, and they stood 8 feet tall, with natural armor plating and weapons that could punch holes through starship hulls, and they had never been defeated. And Kombatsifter looked at Maya and saw something that should not exist, and she was small compared to his warriors, but she moved with fluid grace that spoke of perfect control, and her eyes glowed with blue fire, and he knew that he was facing something beyond his understanding. Battle began, and Maya moved like liquid lightning while the armor predicted every attack and showed her exactly where to strike, and the Kithara tactical systems had analyzed Zalani physiology and knew their weak points better than they did themselves. The first guard swung a weapon that could have cut a tank in half, but Maya ducked under it, and her energy blade opened his throat and he fell, spraying alien blood across the bridge. And the second guard fired a plasma cannon, but Maya absorbed the energy and redirected it back at him. Zeftar fought with the desperation of someone who knew his entire worldview was crumbling, and he had 4 arms and centuries of combat experience, but Maya was something new and terrible and beautiful, and she fought with skills that had been perfected across millennia of galactic warfare. The captain's personal weapon was a molecular disruptor that could unmake matter at the atomic level, but when he fired it at Maya, the armor simply restructured itself and continued protecting her, and she realized that Kithara technology was so advanced that it seemed like magic to lesser species. As counterattack was precise and overwhelming, and she moved faster than Zeftar could follow, and her energy blades found the gaps in his armor, and within seconds he was on the deck bleeding from wounds that would not heal, and his guards were scattered around the bridge like broken toys. She stood over the defeated captain and spoke in his own language, because the armor had analyzed their communications and learned their speech patterns, and she offered him terms that no Zalani had ever heard from a conquered enemy: surrender and become prisoners of war, or watch his crew suffocate, as she vented atmosphere into space. And Zeftar looked into her glowing eyes and saw something that was both human compassion and alien ruthlessness, and he chose survival over death. The surrender signal went out to the entire Zalani fleet, and within minutes, every ship had powered down their weapons, and Maya felt the weight of what she had accomplished, and she had defeated the most powerful military force in the galaxy, with nothing but determination and ancient technology. General Hayes received the transmission on Earth, and she could hardly believe what she was hearing, and humanity had been saved by a 17-year-old girl who had found alien armor in a desert cave and turned herself into something that made entire fleets surrender. Maya looked around the bridge of the World Breaker, and she could feel the armor analyzing the ship's systems and already planning improvements, and she realized that this was just the beginning, and the galaxy was about to learn that Earth was no longer a helpless world but the home of something they had thought was extinct. The Kithara had returned, and they wore human faces and fought with human hearts, but they carried the knowledge and power of the greatest warriors in galactic history, and Maya understood that her victory here would echo across the stars and change everything. News of the Zalani defeat spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and on 1,000 worlds beings who had never heard of Earth suddenly learned that a primitive species had accomplished the impossible and destroyed the most feared military force in known space, and the implications sent shockwaves through every government and organization, from the galactic core to the outer rim. Dr. Kethlon was the galaxy's most respected expert on extinct civilizations, and he worked from a research station orbiting the ancient world of Theros, where the Great Library contained knowledge from 10,000 species, and when he saw the first reports of the human victory, he thought it was some kind of joke or propaganda. But then the images arrived, and Dr. Kethlon felt his blood turn cold as he recognized technology that had not been seen for 3 millennia, and the human warrior war armor that was unmistakably Kithara in design and moved with the fluid grace that had made the ancient race the most feared predators in galactic history. He immediately sent alerts to every major government and scientific institution, and his message was simple and terrifying: in humanity had somehow acquired functional Kithara technology, and the galaxy would never be the same, and old nightmares were awakening, and the age of easy conquest was over. Maya found herself thrust into a role she had never wanted, and Earth's governments needed her to be their representative to the galaxy, but she was still just a teenager from Phoenix who had been studying archaeology 3 weeks ago. And now she carried the hopes and fears of her entire species. Representative Susan Clark worked with Maya to establish communication protocols, and within days, they were receiving messages from dozens of alien governments, and some wanted alliance with this new power, while others barely concealed threats, and Maya could feel the armor analyzing each transmission and preparing responses. The Cathar armor had bonded with her completely, and she could access databases of information that contained the histories of every major species in the galaxy, and what she learned made her sick and angry, because the universe was full of predators who preyed on the weak without consequence. Slavery was common among the advanced species, and entire civilizations existed in bondage to more powerful neighbors, and the strong took what they wanted from the weak and justified it with elaborate philosophies about natural order and survival of the fittest. And Maya realized that her people were about to enter a galaxy where might made right. The armor's AI spoke to her in dreams and showed her images of what the galaxy had been like when the Cathar ruled, and there had been justice then, and the strong protected the weak, and slavery was unknown, and species worked together instead of conquering each other. But the Cathara had made enemies, and eventually those enemies had found a way to destroy them, and for 3,000 years the galaxy had descended into chaos and barbarism, and now the armor had chosen Maya to restore the balance, and she felt the weight of that responsibility like a physical burden. Ambassador Vrex of the hegemony of worlds arrived at Earth 3 days after the Zalani surrender, and he was a tall, thin being with silver skin and too many joints, and his species had built their empire on the labor of conquered races, and he offered humanity a place in their organization. Maya met with Vrex in the United Nations building, and she could see the fear in his alien eyes, even though he tried to hide it behind diplomatic courtesy, and he spoke of mutual cooperation and shared prosperity, but the armor translated his real meaning, and he was testing Earth's strength. The ambassador offered technology and protection in exchange for exclusive trading rights and mining concessions, and Maya listened politely while the armor showed her images of hegemony slave worlds where beings worked until they died and were replaced by fresh captives. When Vrex finished his presentation, Maya smiled and told him that humanity would consider his offer, and she escorted him to his ship personally, and the armor recorded every detail of his vessel's design and analyzed its weapons and defenses and found them wanting compared to Cathara technology. That night Maya stood on the roof of the UN building and looked up at the stars, and she could feel ships moving in the darkness, and some carried ambassadors and trade delegations, but others were scout vessels and spy probes, and the galaxy was watching Earth with growing concern. Representative Clark brought her reports from intelligence agencies around the world, and they were intercepting communications between alien governments, and the messages revealed a disturbing pattern, and many species saw humanity as a threat that needed to be eliminated before it could grow stronger. The armor showed Maya tactical analyses of every major military force in the galaxy, and she could see their strengths and weaknesses, and battle plans began forming in her mind without conscious thought, and she realized that the Kithara had been master strategists as well as warriors. Dar Carter visited Maya at her temporary quarters, and she was worried about her former student, and Maya appreciated the concern. But she could feel something building in the galaxy, and forces were aligning against Earth, and humanity would need every advantage to survive what was coming. The first assassination attempt came on a Thursday, and Maya was walking through Central Park when her enhanced senses detected the molecular disruptor hidden in a vendor's cart, and she moved faster than human eyes could follow, and the would-be assassin never had a chance to fire the weapon. Was hegemony technology, and the assassin was a member of a species that specialized in murder for hire, and Maya let him live long enough to confess who had hired him, and then she snapped his neck with casual efficiency that would have horrified her. Just weeks before, More attempts followed, and each one was more sophisticated than the last, and Maya faced everything from poison gas to quantum explosives, but the armor made her effectively immortal, and she began to understand why the Cathara had been so feared. The trade syndicate tried economic warfare, and they flooded Earth's markets with goods priced below cost, and attempted to create dependencies that would let them control human civilization. But Maya had access to Kithara economic models, and she turned their own tactics against them. Commander Jake Morrison was the first human to pilot a starship built with reverse-engineered alien technology, and he served as Maya's second-in-command, and he watched in amazement as species that had never cooperated began reaching out to Earth for protection. The armor continued to evolve and adapt to new challenges, and Maya could feel it, analyzing every threat and developing countermeasures, and she realized that the Cathara had built their technology to learn and grow and become stronger with each battle. News arrived that the Torgan Empire had declared war on Earth, and they were a militaristic species that had built their reputation on never losing a conflict, and they commanded a fleet of 200 ships and planned to make an example of humanity. Maya felt the armor respond to the threat with something that could only be called anticipation, and she realized that the ancient warriors had enjoyed battle, and the technology was eager to test itself against new opponents, and she felt that eagerness spreading through her own mind. Representative Clark tried to negotiate, but the Torgan Empire had already committed to war, and their ships were moving to war. Earth and Maya knew that this would be different from the Zilani encounter because the Torgans had studied the previous battle and adapted their tactics. The armor showed her projections of the coming conflict, and Maya could see multiple scenarios playing out, and in some of them, Earth survived, and in others humanity was enslaved or extinct, and she realized that her next decisions would determine the fate of her species. Dr. Kethlon sent a final message to the major powers, and his words were simple and prophetic, and he said that the galaxy had forgotten the lessons of history, and the Kethra had returned, and those who opposed them would learn why the ancient warriors had been the apex predators of their Maya stood in the command center and watched the enemy fleet approaching on the displays, and she could feel the armor preparing for battle, and ancient memories stirred in her mind, and she remembered victories and defeats from wars fought before humans had discovered fire, and she knew that the galaxy was about to remember why the name Kithara still inspired nightmares after 3,000 years. 6 months after first contact, Maya Rodriguez had become the most feared and respected being in the galaxy, and her name was spoken in whispers on 1,000 worlds, and some called her savior, while others named her destroyer, but all agreed that she had changed everything, and the old order was crumbling before the rise of something new and terrible and beautiful. The human coalition had grown from a single world to an alliance of 43 species, and Maya operated from the captured Zilani dreadnought that she had renamed the Human's Will, and the ship had been transformed by Cathara technology into something that made other fleets look like toys, and its weapons could crack planets, and its shields could stop stars. Commander Jake Morrison stood beside Maya on the bridge and watched their latest target appear on the display screens, and the hegemony stronghold of Nexus Prime was a fortress world that had never fallen, and it controlled the slave trade for an entire sector, and Maya had decided that its reign of cruelty would end today. The liberation wars had been Maya's idea, and her strategy was simple and effective, and she targeted the worst oppressors first, and freed their slaves, and offered the liberated species a choice to join the coalition or remain neutral. But those who chose to continue slavery and genocide found themselves facing her wrath. Maya no longer looked entirely human, and the armor had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical, and her eyes glowed with blue fire, and her movements had the fluid grace of a predator, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that could command or terrify, depending on her mood. The assault on Nexus Prime began at dawn, and Maya led the attack personally, and she had learned to love battle in a way that would have horrified her old self, but the Cathara memories that lived in the armor whispered that this was what she had been made for, and conflict was the crucible that forged greatness. The fortress world's defenses were legendary, and they had planetary shields that could stop asteroids and weapon batteries that could destroy entire fleets. But Maya had studied their systems for weeks, and the armor had found weaknesses that the builders never knew existed. She descended through atmosphere like a falling star, and the planetary guns tried to track her, but Cathara's stealth technology made her invisible to their sensors, and she landed in the capital city like a force of nature and began her work. The hegemony guards were waiting, and they wore powered armor and carried weapons that could level city blocks, but Maya moved between them like smoke, and her energy blades cut through their defenses, and within minutes, the streets were littered with the remains of the planet's finest warriors. General Patricia Hayes monitored the battle from Earth, and she still found it hard to believe that the girl she had met 6 months ago was now leading a galactic revolution. And Maya's tactical genius had been enhanced by Cathara knowledge until she could see patterns and opportunities that escaped the greatest military minds. The slave pens were hidden beneath the city, and Maya tore through reinforced barriers like they were made of paper, and she found thousands of beings from dozens of species, and they had been broken by years of captivity and torture. But when they saw her glowing eyes, they understood that salvation had come. Maya broadcast her message to every world in hegemony space, and her words were simple and clear, and she said that slavery would no longer be tolerated, and those who freed their captives would be spared, but those who refused would face the consequences, and she meant every word. The response was swift and predictable, and the Hegemony Council declared Maya an enemy of civilization, and they assembled the largest fleet in their history, and 2,000 ships moved toward human space with orders to destroy the coalition and restore order to the galaxy. But Maya was ready, and she had spent months preparing for this moment, and the armor had analyzed every ship in the hegemony fleet and found their weaknesses, and the battle plans that formed in her mind were works of art that would have impressed the greatest Cathara strategist. The Battle of the Broken Chain took place in the Centaurus sector, and it would be remembered as the day the old galaxy died. In Maya commanded a force of only 300 ships, but they were crewed by species that had been slaves just months before, and they fought with the fury of the liberated. Maya led the charge, and the humans' will and the ship's weapons had been enhanced beyond anything the galaxy had seen, and her first volley destroyed 50 enemy vessels, and the shock waves of the explosions lit up space like a new sun, and the hegemony fleet began to understand what they were facing. The armor had taught Maya to think in 3 dimensions, and she moved her forces through space like a conductor directing an orchestra, and every ship was exactly where it needed to be, and the enemy found themselves trapped in a web of crossfire and destruction. Commander Morrison watched in awe as Maya coordinated the battle, and she was controlling hundreds of variables simultaneously, and her tactical decisions were perfect, and the hegemony fleet was being systematically dismantled by an opponent they had underestimated. The enemy admiral tried to retreat, but Maya had anticipated that move, and coalition ships emerged from hyperspace behind the fleeing vessels, and the trap was complete, and the most powerful military force in the sector surrendered rather than face total annihilation. Word of the victory spread faster than light, and on slave worlds across the galaxy, beings looked up at the stars and dared to hope, and rebellions began spontaneously as the oppressed remembered that they outnumbered their oppressors, and the phrase, as Maya Rodriguez showed us, became a rallying cry. Dar Helen Carter often reflected on that day in the Arizona desert, when her student had touched ancient armor and changed the course of galactic history, and Maya had become something unprecedented, and she wielded power that made civilizations tremble, but she was still driven by human values of justice and protection. The Trade Syndicate tried to assassinate Maya with a quantum bomb that could erase matter from existence, but the armor simply absorbed the energy and converted it to power, and Maya's retaliation was swift and brutal, and the Syndicate's leadership was found floating in space with expressions of terror frozen on their face. Says Maya's greatest achievement was not military, but inspirational, and across the galaxy enslaved species began to rebel, and they cited the example of the human girl who had stood against impossible odds and won. And the old systems of oppression began to crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. The Vorthan Collective sent diplomats to negotiate, and they offered to end slavery in their territory in exchange for peace, and Maya accepted because the armor had taught her that victory without mercy was just another form of tyranny, and she wanted to build something better than what had come before. Darkathlon published his final research paper, and it was titled The Return of the Cathara and the End of the Dark Age, and he wrote that Maya Rodriguez had proven that power without conscience was ultimately self-defeating, and that the galaxy needed guardians who fought for justice rather than conquest. Maya stood on the observation deck of the humans. Willen looked out at the stars, and she could see coalition ships patrolling sectors that had once been ruled by fear and suffering, and the armor whispered that this was how the galaxy was supposed to be. And she had accomplished what the original Cathara had started thousands of years ago. The transformation was not complete, and there were still pockets of resistance and species that clung to the old ways, but Maya knew that change took time, and she was patient because the armor had shown her that lasting victory required more than military might, and she was building something that would endure. Representative Susan Clark brought news from Earth, and humanity had taken its place among the great civilizations. But they had done so as liberators rather than conquerors, and the distinction mattered because Maya had chosen to use her power to protect rather than dominate, and that choice had made all the different children across dozens of worlds learned about the human teenager who found ancient armor in a desert cave and used it to free the galaxy, and they understood that courage was not about being fearless, but about doing what was right, even when facing impossible odds, and Maya had become a symbol of hope for beings she would never meet. The armor had evolved beyond its original programming, and it was no longer just Cathara technology, but something new that combined the best of ancient wisdom with human compassion. And Maya realized that she was not just wearing the armor, but had become part of something greater than either humanity or the Cathara. Had been a lone commander? Morrison asked her what came next, and Maya smiled and said that the galaxy was vast, and there were still species suffering under tyrants and planets ruled by fear, and as long as injustice existed, she would fight it, because that was what the armor had chosen her to do, and what her human heart demanded. The old galaxy was dying, and something better was being born, and Maya Rodriguez had proven that the most powerful weapon in the universe was not energy or matter, but the simple belief that everyone deserved to be free, and she carried that belief to the stars, and changed everything she touched. Years would pass, and the coalition would grow, and the galaxy would slowly heal from millennia of oppression, and children would grow up in a universe where slavery was just a word in history books, and the strong protected the weak instead of preying upon them, and they would have Maya to thank for that gift. She was no longer the 17-year-old girl who had stumbled into an ancient chamber, but she had not forgotten where she came from, and sometimes she would dream of Arizona and archaeology and the simple life she had left behind. But she knew that some destinies could not be avoided, and hers had been written in the stars. The armor pulsed with gentle warmth, and Maya felt the presence of the Cathara, who had worn it before her, and they approved of what she had accomplished, and she understood that she was part of a legacy that stretched back across eons, and would continue long after she was gone. Maya Rodriguez had become the galaxy's conscience, and its most powerful protector, and she had proven that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers, but their unwavering belief that everyone deserved dignity and freedom, and she had carried that belief to the stars and made it reality.